Please welcome Learned and Professor of Law Emeritus at Harvard University, Mary Ann Glendon.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for being here for today's discussion of government and the religious life of citizens. This topic has many dimensions, and we are very fortunate to have before us, or with us today, distinguished experts on all of the dimensions. In order to get things started, I'd like to just offer three very brief observations about the topic. The first, I'm sure, is known to everybody here, that it's the alarming fact that governmental restrictions on religion around the world are at their highest level since the Pew Forum started counting them in 2007. And the worst, the most severe restrictions, arrest, imprisonment, even torture, they are increasing at a rapid rate. Second, those governmental restrictions are increasing at a rapid rate also in countries where their manifestations are less violent. They're less violent, they're less immediately shocking, but they do have devastating effects on the lives of persons of faith and faith communities. And finally, this is a disappointing observation that in many countries that pride themselves on being liberal democracies, tolerant societies, open societies, in many of those places, the governmental response to these violations and these situations has been less than vigorous. It almost seems sometimes as though when religious freedom comes into conflict with other rights or perceived important objectives, that it is religious freedom that is regularly subordinated. So our three distinguished panelists are going to share with us their wisdom on these and other dimensions of government's relationship to the religious life of citizens, and it's my privilege to introduce now, first, Dr. Andrew Bennett of the Religious Freedom Institute, Dr. Allison Ralph of the Aspen Institute's Religion and Society program, and Rabbi David Saperstein, former Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom. Welcome, everyone. Andrew, I'm going to start with a question for you. It's about the relationship between governments and international organizations and the many faith-based institutions that provide essential social services like education, health, aid to the neediest people in their own countries and around the world. Why has that relationship between governments and those associations become so fraught? Why has it have become a hotspot for religious liberty disputes, and what can we do about it?
Well, I mean, this is a critical question, and for those of us that have been involved in advancing religious freedom at the governmental level, we see, I think that there's a bit of an amnesia and a challenge with formation in some respect. The first thing I want to say, Marianne, is that we have to remind ourselves continually that religious freedom is fundamentally about the public living out of our most deeply held beliefs, whether they're theistic or atheistic, whatever it might be. It's not about the inner life. We're always free there. And there's a fundamental link between faith and practice and public action. So people of faith act based on their faith. And so I think there's a real challenge right now with international organizations, within governments, around an amnesia, a forgetfulness about how faith-based organizations and faith communities work, and how their faith and their beliefs compel them and impel them into action, whether it's in the area of refugee resettlement, whether it's in the area of ministering to the poor, to the homeless, and so forth. And this is in countries around the world, but particularly in liberal democracies, I would say, including my own country of Canada and certainly here in the United States. We have to also recall that international organizations and governments can't do it all. They have a complementary role to faith communities. It's a different role. They can mobilize on a broad scale what needs to be done to achieve the goals that faith communities also have, to help the poor, to feed the homeless, to comfort the migrant, and so forth, especially in conflict situations. Now, they're both limited in their respective ability to act. Faith-based organizations are typically more nimble and I think more nuanced and can act at a very local level. But institutional actors like international organizations, governments, need to be able to have an understanding of how to speak to religious people. And I think so often there's an inability to speak to religious actors because it's a challenge of formation. I think for many of us that living in liberal democracies have gone through public education, we're often not equipped to speak religiously. And so when it comes to being in positions of influence within international organizations globally or within governments, there's sometimes this inability to actually engage religious actors because we don't know what to say, we don't understand how they function, and again, what mobilizes them to act. I'll put it very succinctly. We have to ask, will the state or an international organization console you while you're dying? Can the state hug you when you die? No. But a faith community can, or people that are involved with a faith-based organization can. And so there needs to be more complementarity, more engagement between government, international organizations, and faith-based organizations for serving the common good, for the good of all. And we need to work much harder as people engaged in international religious freedom in forming those actors in those governments, in those international organizations, to engage faith communities in a much more robust fashion, because they're not just an option in providing these services, they are essential globally.
Thank you, Andrew. Allison, your program at the Aspen Institute lifts up and practices and encourages a beautiful vision of a pluralistic society where people of all faiths and no faith not only live together in relative peace, but flourish and encourage one another. But when we look around us, in our own countries and in other countries that aspire to that vision, we see much evidence indicating that your task is a hard one. Please share with us some of the things you've learned and tell us what you think Friends of International Religious Freedom can do to promote that wonderful vision.
Thank you so much, Marianne, and such a pleasure and honor to be here with you and my other colleagues on the stage today and with all of you. I want to start by bringing us back to the government and the life of its citizens and say that as an American citizen and other American citizens here, we have an incredible opportunity and responsibility to take responsibility for the culture that we create here because we are the people of the government. And that means that we can shape how we interact with each other, not just on a personal level, but on an international level too. And I want to lift that up in this context of pluralism because we know that tit-for-tat violence escalation happens across boundaries of nation and across boundaries of religious communities, so that an individual action against a religious minority in one place can result in a governmental reaction against that original perpetrator's community in a different location. So we have a responsibility to each other, to ourselves, and to our communities to put it simply, to be the change, right? To be what we want to see in the world. And so I want to begin with that and with the recommendation to let's change the script on religious freedom rights in one precise way. We have a way of being where we are demanding our own rights and demanding rights for others, and I think that's right and good, but also it sets us up for this culture of defensiveness and attack and scarcity mindset and all of that stuff. what if we changed the way of thinking to one of giving rights to one another? And that is something that as American citizens have the option to do, to gift rights to one another. It was really beautiful change and brings me personally out of the mindset of frustration when I see rights here in the States not being shared equally and equitably, and allows me to rethink how I want to respond to folks. And so that's one of the things that we know. We always say this is really about relationships. So if we ground that relationship in a culture of generosity for each other, that can affect not only our personal relationships, but our relationship with our government and other citizens here and elsewhere abroad as well. And I want to finally say, too, that I come at this from a perspective of a non-theistic, formerly angry atheist perspective, who came into this work being abused and bullied for being atheist by evangelical Christians. I know what it means to be on the side of the minority, and I also know that that treatment of me was wrong, and I know that I do not want to create that. I don't want to treat people in the way that I was treated. And so I offer to you, every one of you here, that freedom to be and to believe and to participate in your communities. And I also offer you the freedom to believe that I am going to hell. I really do. It's okay.
Thank you so much, Allison. David, much of this summit has been devoted to discussions of restrictions on religious liberties and freedoms. But there are many places in the world where governments actually promote religion. And so I wonder if you could tell us how to think about places, established churches or other forms of promoting one religion or maybe more than one religion. How should we think about those in relation to the purpose of this summit, which is to promote religious liberty?
Let me begin just by acknowledging the person who is the moderator of this program, because Marian Glendon's academic career, her public service, and her prodigious intellectual contribution to this issue and many others has had such an impact on our work and on America. There are three rubrics you can think about in terms of the relationship of government and the religious life of individuals that take us to your question. The first is in what religious freedom means. The first is those governments, and there are many, who ensure that nobody's rights as a citizen will ever depend upon their religious identity, their religious beliefs, their peaceful religious practices. That has to be a hallmark, without which you can't have religious freedom, and that is one way, by guaranteeing that governments can help nurture religious freedom. Secondly, there is the ability of governments to protect the fundamental rights of religious individuals and groups of people to practice their religion freely, which means, as I indicated for those of you who were here yesterday, it is inexorably bound up with human rights in general. If you do not have freedom of the press, the freedom to publish what you want, you can't publish your prayer books, you can't publish your sacred texts, you can't publish your educational materials. If you don't have freedom of speech, you don't have freedom of the pulpit. If you don't have freedom of protest, you don't have the freedom to engage in the prophetic witness as a moral goal to a society that our religions share in common. So pushing the governments that strengthen democracy and human rights are contributing to religion and the ability to do what you were describing, both of you described before. And then the question is, what is the structure of that interaction? You have first those countries like I regard America, in which separation of church and state is pivotal. There's a debate in America, in this room, among some other folks here. And I think everyone knows I come from a position that sees the wall separating church and state as having kept government out of religion and allowed religion to flourish with a diversity and strength in America unmatched in a democratic world. Here, if that works, that is fine. But that has to still allow religion to work on its own without interfering with religion. Secondly, you can have established religions. Think about the UK, think about Scandinavian countries, other countries around the world that have established religion, but do guarantee that everyone, even if they're not from the established religion, have those equal rights and have the freedom to function. The complicated issue is, which is very frequent, when there's established religion, particularly if there's a large majority of one religion, where the government favors that religion, the institutions of that religion, and the people of that religion, it will almost always be the minority who will suffer, and minorities suffer all across the world, and all of you are part of faith groups that somewhere are minority religions. And a lot of our work has to do with protecting the rights of those minority religions in that third category.
Hear, hear.
So, David, there are many models of religious freedom in the world, and I am wondering, here's a topic paper for those of you who may be students looking for something to write about. It would be interesting to compare the formal legal arrangements regarding church and state with what the actual data is about religious freedom violations in any particular country, and to see whether, let's say, you're better off in a place like France, where there's strict separation, or in a place like one of the European established churches. And the reason I'm pondering that in relation to the remarks of our other two speakers is that here in this summit, we're talking a great deal about law and government, but we're also talking an awful lot about civil society. And maybe what we have to remind ourselves over and over again is that while law does have a certain effect on culture, culture generally is prior to law.
I'm really glad you raised that. Without having a culture that embraces this idea of the fundamental rights I talked about that government gives, but without the culture that absorbs that, you can't have religious pluralism, you can't have religious tolerance, et cetera. So it's crucially important. Let me just add one note to what, a nuance, something that Andrew said in his presentations. And I know, Andrew, we're very dear friends and close colleagues, as our tenure as ambassadors for religious freedom took place at the same time. He was fantastic in this regard. We often travel the world together working on these things. So I know you're going to agree with the nuance I'm going to do. But make no mistake about it. At the same time, the Pew numbers that talk about 80% of the population of the world living in remember, many of those are in the majority in those countries, and actually they think they live okay. So just in response to your question, it's a nuance. But in terms of your comment, Andrew, one of the most horrifying forms of religious repression that we see today actually do try to deny the right to believe what you want. When China is trying to destroy the culture of everything about Tibetan Buddhism and Uyghur Islam, it's placing people to live in the houses of people to be sure nothing's being taught they don't want. When Russia is taking Ukrainian children away from their families and sending them to be raised by somebody else, they're trying to alter the inner life of people as well. And we should not make any pretense that, well, the integrity of inside, no one can ever touch that. In this world in which we're in, and where most social media brings ideas of, so deeply into the entrenched life of kids growing up, it is possible to alter that inner life, and that is one of the most dangerous threats of all.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Andrew now, and Allison after Andrew, to offer some final reflections about government and the religious life of citizens.
Well, I'm going to pick up on this point that David just raised, and it'll be my final point, is it behooves governments, if they're truly in the interest of advancing the common good, and that should be what every government is about, the common good of human flourishing or something akin to that, to understand how faith communities serve that same common good. And if they don't understand that, then they're going to really struggle to achieve the goals that they have as governments, public policy and so forth goals, that help to further that same common good. Let's take the extreme example that David just raised of China. I mean, if for the Chinese Communist Party to not see that these faith communities, including the growing number of house churches and so forth, that these could be forces for good at the local level in some of these provinces to support maybe some of the policy outcomes that the Chinese Communist Party has, whatever those might be, but to help with human flourishing and to take the burden off the broader administration of the state because these organizations can be nimble. Okay, they're not going to agree with Communist Party ideology, but they should be granted the freedom to operate so as to advance the common good. And governments need to see that no matter what country they're in.
Allison.
Thank you. It's hard to follow you. I want to pick up on something that you have been saying about the ability of faith communities to do good in the world, and that is something that we lift up frequently at the Religion and Society program. We also want to make sure that we're not whitewashing anything and acknowledge the fact that people are terrible people to one another on the basis of their faith, and that we also need to be able to have that conversation openly. We need to do all of that and across all different sectors of society. One of the projects that I lead is about opening conversation about religion, about the good of religion. If you're worried about it, let's talk about it. Within the culture of philanthropy in the U.S., which is standoffish, as many of you probably know, about religious, faith-based organizations that can do so much good, and about religion-related topics in general. And none of that serves us well, that inability to talk about it. As you've already heard from my own story, religion is a minefield, an absolute minefield of personal and collective hurts. And if we can't learn as individuals and as societies and citizens with one another of our countries and across the globe, then we're not going to be able to solve any of these problems. So let's start there. I know you already do this already, but this is about changing our culture so that we can move forward together.
Can I have one final word on this, too? First, Aspen makes such a contribution to that debate and that discussion, and really you guys are crucially important. So for me, the answer above all, at a macro level, is democracy. If the great democratic experiment in human history we are engaged in now fails, if autocracies and plutocracies that represent most of the history of humankind becomes again the norm, and if the coercive power of government is used to pick and choose which religions can thrive and which cannot, we will not have religious freedom, and every religious minority will be left without rights and without freedom to function. So the battle for democracy and human rights is really the battle that will determine whether or not we succeed with our focus on religious freedom.
And all the more reason, friends, to thank all of you for being here, because as Ambassador Brownback said this morning, it begins with us at the grassroots level. So thank you, God bless you, and thank the panelists.